Hey everybody, I'm Jack Reeder with Future Pastimes, and I'm a designer for the expansions to the 2019 edition of the Dune board game, published by Gale Force 9. And in this video, I wanted to make the case for basic Dune, why it actually is a lot of fun to play, and I do recommend it. Now, Dune is a game that has a basic rule set and an advanced rule set. Although technically in the 1979 Avalon Hill edition, there were just the rules. Here's the rules to play Dune. And then they had some optional rules that you could throw in. And more or less the optional rules are the advanced rules set. And part of the optional rules that they had were the double spice blow, which was sort of a hand-in-hand element to the spice dialing. And then every faction had sort of optional rules that became the advanced advantages for those factions. So I know that there are some who don't like the fact that there are two rule sets. I know that Shut Up and Sit Down were like, oh, we wish there was just, here's how to play Dune. I actually don't have a problem with there being a basic set of rules and an advanced set of rules. I think if you're sitting down with people who are new to Dune, it's your first time playing it, play basic. And once you are familiar with the basic rules, if you get together again, then try out advanced rules. It seems like a pretty straightforward approach to Dune. Learn the game using the basic rules, master those rules, or get familiar enough with how things work. Then you're ready for the advanced rules. Now, the two games are really not that different from each other. And it is really the advanced battle rules that separate the two rule sets the most. There are some extra elements in there, things like the advanced Kurama effect that you get, but that doesn't come up in the game very often. You can only do it once per game, and you have to have one of the two Kurama cards in order to do it. Plus, there are so many other things you can do with the Kurama card that maybe you'd rather do one of those things. So again, that doesn't come up that often. Some of the advanced advantages, most of the factions don't have that many advanced advantages. I think Fremen and Bene Gesserit are the two big exceptions, but for the other factions, it's usually one, maybe two other things that you can do. The bulk of what they can do are their basic advantages. So there's a lot to use and leverage in the basic game that makes it a pretty enjoyable. Now, I know a few people in particular who prefer basic, and that would be the original designers, because basic actually was what they designed. When you talk about the 1979 rules, those were the rules that they designed. That was how you played it. A lot of the optional rule stuff was actually not designed by them. Jack Kittredge, Bill Eberly, and Peter Alaka, who were the original designers of Dune, it was actually inserted into the game by Avalon Hill. So they don't necessarily endorse the optional rules that much. When we play Dune together, we're playing basic Dune. And when we're designing the expansions, we spend most of our time in basic playing that. It's when we finally are like, we have to play test these advanced rules that I reacquaint them with how advanced combat works and some of the other advanced advantages. The advantages are they're all pretty straightforward and easy to understand, so it's just more that you can do. So if you're a player who, after having a faction that can do three things, if three things is your limit, like you're like, I can keep track of that, but once I start to get to 4 or 5 different things that my faction can do, I just don't have the mental bandwidth to really capitalize on that, then basic Dune is definitely going to be more accessible. There aren't as many things that the factions can do in basic, but there's plenty that they can do, and it is all pretty thematic. So there's a lot that you can get out of the Dune experience. Basic rules also really lend themselves to lower player counts as well. I actually kind of enjoy 4-player Dune at basic. And again, I know some people who think that Dune plays great at 3, and that would be the original 3 designers, because it was the 3 of them playing it the most while they were designing that game. I don't know how many times they got together with 4, 5, or 6 players, and maybe they never did. I'm sure that they will tell you that they did, but, post-proof or retract. But they say, yeah, it's great at 3 players. Now, I would say that 3 players has its own challenges, and that's by and large that it's hard to stronghold block at 3 players. You've got those 5 strongholds, And in a 5 or 6 player game, it's much easier to say, hey, let's make a deal. You and I, you're in that stronghold. I will join you in that stronghold and throw the fight so that we can prevent player 3 from getting in there and going for a runaway win. That is harder to pull off with 3 players. It's one of the reasons why with Dune Conquest, we had the blocked stronghold tokens. So for a 2-player, you're actually eliminating one of the 5 strongholds. And that does make it easier to play that game at 2 players. But even at 3 players, we're not blocking a stronghold. So you have to watch out for it. But basic rules, it's much more accessible in there. I would say probably, though, that the biggest argument for basic is the combat. Basic Dune combat is so fantastic and elegant, and it's the best combat system I think ever devised for a board game. And it is really simple and straightforward. You look at the number of forces that you have in the battle and you decide, how many of those forces am I willing to sacrifice in order to win this battle? If you've got 5 in there, you look at the battle wheel and you can say, yeah, I want to have at least 1 left over, so I'm willing to sacrifice 4 of them. That's your number, plus the leader strength. Higher total wins. It's that simple. It gets more complicated in advanced, and that's because you've got the half dial. You're like, I've got 3 guys and I'm willing to sacrifice 1.5 of them. and if you sacrifice 1.5 of them, 2 of them are dying. You can't have half a token. If you cut somebody in half, they're not going to survive that procedure. So, but it's a matter of the spice. You have to spend a spice to count 1 force as a whole 1. Otherwise, it only counts as a half. And that, some people are like, all right, I think I can figure that out. But then you throw in the Sardaukar, and you're like, all right, these 2 forces are worth a half. This one is worth 1, but if you spend a spice, it's worth 2. You've got 2 of each, and you've got 2 spice. And what am I dialing? I don't even know. It does get complicated for some people, and you do have to make sure that you understand how that works before you do it. But again, it is just simple math that you are putting together halves and wholes. And so if you can master that, you can master it. That's the hardest part about advanced rules. The second hardest part is like, all right, can I keep track of 5 things that my faction can do, as well as any effects that I have on my treachery cards? And then, the other modules, like, are we using tech tokens? Are we using leader skills? Those sorts of things. I like that sort of thing in gaming, which is why I prefer advanced. It's the biggest reason that I like advanced, is because each faction has more that they can do, and each thing is thematic as well. So you're injecting a lot of theme into the game. So full disclosure, if I'm given the choice between basic and advanced, I will want to play advanced, because there's just more that can be done, and I like leveraging that in the game. But there is a lot in basic for you to take a look at. So let's just look at the factions themselves. So you've got Atreides. They still have their bidding advantage. They still can look at the next spice card, and they still have their battle prescience. And the spice card is probably even more effective in basic, because with advanced you have the 2 spice blows, but Atreides only gets to see 1 of those cards. So if that first card is a territory, they don't necessarily know there's going to be a nexus in the next turn, because they don't get to look at the next card, which for Spice Blow 2 could be Shai Hulud. So that is a factor. And of course, in basic, there is only going to be 1 card, and they get to look at it. They know if it's a worm or not. If it's a worm, yes, you're going to draw another card to get the territory. But the point is, they know that there's a nexus, and that last territory, any forces that are there are going to get eaten by that worm. So it gets a little bit fuzzy in advanced, and that's not as an effective an advantage in advanced, which is kind of a weird difference there in there. With the Bene Gesserit, they're still doing the prediction, which again is, a lot of times you're just, you're checking a box and hoping that it works out for you. So it's not really that impactful. They got the spiritual advisors, which just means that when other people ship from off planet, they get to send 1 down to the polar sink for free. Also not that impactful, but they still have the voice, and that's the big deal. And it's arguably the most powerful advantage in the whole game. So the fact that they still have that still makes them competitive. But obviously the Bene Gesserit are much more powerful in advanced than they would be, but that's pretty true of all the factions. So we move on to the Emperor. They just have their bidding advantage of getting paid when other people buy the treachery cards. No Sardaukar, but in basic, there is only the one spice blow. So you're going to have less spice in the game turn after turn, which means that any economic faction is even more powerful in basic than they are, all things being equal. You've got that steady income. Some of the bids might not get as high because people don't have the double spice blows necessarily for them to collect, plus the collection you get for controlling Carthag, Arakeen, or Tuix. It's only a couple of spice, but again, the average amount that the players have is a little bit lower in basic, but you still have people buying cards and you're still getting a regular income throughout the game. So the Emperor is still doing pretty well, even without the 5 Sardaukar. With the Harkonnen, you still have all 4 of your traders. You still have the double hand size and the free card every time you buy a card. So Harkonnen, very effective in basic. They're not really tempered that much. The Fremen are taking the biggest hit, and that is because they're much stronger in combat in advanced because, 1, they've got no spy styling. All of their forces count at full strength all the time, and 2, they've got the 3 Fedaykin who count double, and you can be pretty clever about how you move those guys around. So they've just got their movement, which is 2 territories. They got the free shipping to anywhere within 2 territories of the Great Flat. They get the Shai Hulud, but in basic, that's going to be even less effective because there is, again, only 1 spice blow. So, and you could go many turns before you ever have a worm show up, and then the odds of the Fremen being in that territory when the worm does show up, not great. So the Fremen are a little bit weaker overall in basic. They're still relatively competitive. The extra movement definitely helps. They still have the 3 free revival, which helps, and they're only needing that spice to buy treachery cards. So if they go after the 1 spice blow, if they're able to collect that spice, then they can be very formidable in the following turns. But I will say that the Fremen are going to be the trickiest to play in basic, so be aware of that. If you do have the other expansion factions, maybe you think about Fremen sitting one out. The Spacing Guild, they still got their income from the shipments for other factions from off planet. They still have guild rates, so half-price shipment on there. They can still cross-ship, of course, or back to their reserves. Not that big a deal. The really only thing they're not doing is going out of their turn order, which, while very effective, a lot of the times they just want to go last to see what's going on, and now they've got to actually participate. So it makes it for interesting. You're less likely to get the guild stall out in basic than you in advanced. The Ixians, very powerful. They still have their start of game advantage where they're taking the best treachery card. They still do the bidding advantage where they're suppressing a card and knowing what's going to be in that auction. They still have the cyborgs and the suboids. They still have the hit immobile stronghold that they can move around. So the Ixians, very powerful in basic. The Tleilaxu, arguably more powerful in basic because they do have that income. With the less spice on the board, any spice that you're able to earn becomes even more important. And again, as the game goes on and people are getting their free revivals or making deals to buy their dead leaders, Tleilaxu can capitalize on that. And of course, they still have their face dancers, which is the scariest part of the Tleilaxu faction. Chom, they have a lot of their advantages, but again, because there's less spice in there, there's more likely to be players who will collect Chom Charity. So their Chom Charity advantage will take a little bit of a hit, but they still have the ability to earn cards by discarding duplicates or worthless cards, or using those worthless cards for their special advantages. And they still have their inflation token, which lets them double Chom Charity and or cancel it in whatever order. And Riches, they still have the no-field tokens, and with less spice on the board, it becomes more important that they can ship for the price of 1 force all the time. And they still have their auctions for selling their 10 Riches treachery cards, which means that they do have an income as well. And again, because there's less spice, whatever income they're able to get becomes even more effective in basic. Although, again, with the Emperor, you have the chances of people not being able to bid as high. But the flip side of that is that Riches can sometimes win their own auctions even more if they have managed to get a hold of some spice. So the factions themselves, they're still pretty effective. They got a lot of thematic things that they can do in basic. One of the other interesting things about Basic is the Storm. So the Fremen Storm deck is only used in Advanced with Fremen in the game. You don't normally use that deck of cards, and you definitely don't use it in Basic. So what happens in Basic is the last two players who had their hands on battle wheels, usually because they fought last at the previous turn, they're going to be dialing the Storm. That's how you do Storm movement in Basic. Every turn, two people are dialing between 1, 2, or 3. And that means the Storm is going to be moving 2 to 6 sectors every turn. So you tend to get the Storm moving farther and farther on average than you do in Advanced, because the Storm deck has a 1, and it is totally random. So the players don't have much influence, but you can have a big influence on Storm order in Basic because you are dialing some of that. You can also make deals with people to say, look, let's make sure that we wipe out so-and-so's forces in that sector, but we'll both dial a 3. Or let's both dial a 2 and we can lock down one of these strongholds. So this is an element to the game that does not exist in Advanced, and it is a really interesting element of gameplay, and it makes that Storm phase kind of an important phase. So that's one of the reasons why I do like Basic, is I like that dynamic of having some say about it. I've even had people talk about spice bribes. Now, I know that spice bribing is something that the original designers, they never did and still don't when they play. And they recommend that you just do that in Advanced. It was kind of an optional rule element, so they still think of it in that mindset of Advanced, but it's not a hard and fast rule. And so when I play Basic, I make sure that we understand that we do allow spice bribes. It's still useful for tradies to be able to take bribes in order to share card knowledge, and same thing with Ixians. It's important for factions to be able to bribe each other to stronghold block, which is still an important thing that you can do in Basic. So I think that bribing should be always considered available as part of Basic. You bribe the players to spice, it goes in front of their shield, they collect it in the Mentat pause. It should have really no impact on Basic. But even if you're not doing it, you can still make deals in Basic as long as they don't involve spice bribes, if that's the rule set that you want to play. So that's by and large my case for why Basic is still a good way to play Dune. So I would say that, again, if you have fewer than 6, people will say that 6 is the best number to play at Dune, and I'm one of those people who would agree with that. But if you're like, well, there's only 4 of us here and we want to play Dune, then play it and play Basic. One of the other things about that is it tends to be a quicker game. And you're not as likely to go 10 turns in a 4-player Basic game. You can usually get that game done in about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, which is nice, because a lot of times Dune goes 3 or 4 hours, which, again, I don't see it as a criticism, but it is what it is, as they like to say. And again, the battling, that's your big divider, and that's the biggest reason why I think some people do play Basic, is because they're just afraid of that. And I'll make the case for Advanced in a separate video. Like I said, that's my preferred way to play Dune, and I'll go into all the details of that. Let me know why you prefer Basic, or why you don't, or other elements to Basic that you appreciate and like, and look forward to if you do end up having to play Basic, especially if you look at it as I have to play Basic, because we had too many new people and we just couldn't get into teaching them Advanced. Let me know in the comments. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.